a word you used earlier, hoax, is something that I'd like to talk about. It does bring us a little bit away from the contemporary discussion, but I think it does tie in nicely with the discussion of documentation. And what I have in mind is, I think your first real big work that brought you acclaim, and that was dealing with Joan Peters' book from Time.
That's the original.
Oh, really? I can see it now. But I'll just keep saying this book from time immemorial, which at the time it came out, I think was a huge bestseller, and it really ties into another of the talking points of pro-Israel speakers and historians, which also interestingly ties to this quote from Mark Twain that people bring up all the time, which is that Palestine was an absolutely uninhabited place before the Zionist movement. And for this reason, Palestinians can be thought of as occupiers or invaders or people who do not belong on the land at all. And this, to some extent, for various reasons, might justify the way that they're being treated.
Well, the United States was it was a wilderness, a virgin land, it was called. And you could say by current standards, it was thinly populated, the United States. Exactly how many, I guess the last numbers, I haven't looked at it in decades, but the last numbers I think north of the Rio Grande, they said 8 to 12 million people occupied it, which is the size of New York City and its suburbs right now for the whole of North America. So by that standard, yes, it was sparsely populated. By the standard, as I understand it, and I'm no demographer, but I've read the demography of Palestine, by the standards of its time, it was, the density of population was normal for its time. The premise of the Joan Peters book was that this was the original.
It's a very tattered copy. I can see you've been through it.
This was the book I went through with a kind of fanaticism. She called it Joan Peters. She didn't write the book, so we have to always put it in quotation.
When did it come out? Maybe you could show it to this camera.
It came out in 1984. And it came out just at the point where I had completed the research phase of my doctoral dissertation.
That was at Princeton, right?
Yes.
Just here.
And this book, I walked into, at that time, it was called Harper and Row. It then became Harper Collins. I don't even know if it's around anymore. Or the book companies have been swallowed up by these conglomerates. So if you read the back of the book, all the who's who of the Jewish intelligentsia, Barbara Tuchman. This book is a historical event in itself, a discovery that has lain in the dark all along until its revelation by Joan Peters. Barbara Tuchman was a senior historian.
Yeah, I read her in high school.
Yeah. Saul Bellow. This book dissolves the claims made by nationalist agitators and correct the false history by which these unfortunate Arabs are imposed upon and exploited. And Lucy DeWidowitz, she wasn't really a historian, but for the time she was called a historian. She wrote this famous book called The War Against the Jews. She wrote, "From time immemorial will surely change the way we think about that fiercely contested land once called Palestine," and on and on. And it was a national bestseller. And its essential thesis was very simple. Palestine was empty on the eve of Zionist colonization. The Zionist colonizers came in, made the desert bloom, and when they made the desert bloom, all these Arabs from neighboring states surreptitiously entered Palestine and pretended to be indigenous to the land. So that was a effective way of disposing of any Palestinian claims to Palestine. And I have to say that I had, prior to that moment, succumbed to many illusions of my own as a youth about China. I would say in retrospect, I was probably half right, half wrong about Maoist China, Chairman Mao, Maoist China. But I did entertain a very significant component of illusions. I was a Maoist. And I was quite mortified when Mao Zedong passed from the scene. His followers, they were called back then the Gang of Four, were overthrown in short order, and all of what was called Maoism was reversed very rapidly. And so I wasn't prepared to go through that mortification a second time. And I had to entertain the possibility that everything I had read on the subject for my doctoral dissertation was, to quote Saul Bellow, false history. And so I sat down and I went through this book with an element of fanaticism, determined to discover on my own whether it was or wasn't the truth, that there was no such thing as Palestinians.
And that's the first copy you got?
Yes, this was the first copy.
It's seen better days.
I went through it every night after work. It had at the very end, it had 1,853 footnotes. I went through every one. I used the New York Public Library, the research library on 42nd Street, which has just an incredible collection. And at the end, it had this demographic study. And I don't know anything about demographics. I confess to that. But I went through it over and over and over again, trying to figure out how this study worked. Because the study came with, at the end, I'll just show you. The study came at the end, where you can read it, who was the...
Philip M. Hauser, Director Emeritus, Population Research Center at the University of Chicago.
Right. So, the director of the Population Center at the University of Chicago. And he said all her numbers were right. And if all of her numbers were right, I was, for the second time, all wrong. And I went through it, and eventually I discovered that the demographic study was a hoax. Hauser was a liar. There's no other word for it. I mean, you lose a lot of respect from academia for academia once you become. I never really was an academic, but I was tentatively or tenuously an academic. And so I was able to prove, and nobody disputed afterwards, the entire book was a hoax.